Mark Williams had always believed in the perfect life. He worked relentlessly for it every hour, every day, every sacrifice. At 32, he had it all. A successful career at a prestigious law firm in Manhattan, a luxurious apartment with a breathtaking view of the skyline, and a fiancée, Julia, whom he believed to be his soulmate. They had been together for 5 years, and everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place for their wedding, just a month away. Mark felt a sense of excitement and contentment every time he thought about marrying Julia. She was beautiful, intelligent, and made him feel like he mattered. She was everything he ever wanted. Everything was going perfectly, or so he thought. That evening, the crispness of fall in New York was evident in the air. The city buzzed with life, but for Mark, there was a subtle unease creeping in, something he couldn't quite place. He had just finished a long day at work, and as usual, was heading to the cafe they frequented on the corner of their street. It had become their little routine meeting after work, sharing coffee and unwinding after the day's events. But this evening, there was a shift. Mark couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off. His mind was clouded, but he tried to ignore it. When he entered the cafe, Julia was sitting at their usual table by the window, her face buried in her phone. She didn't seem to notice him walking in. Mark, trying to shake the nagging feeling that had started to rise, walked over to her. As he got closer, he noticed her eyes flickered between the phone and the window, shifting unnaturally fast. It felt out of place, and Mark's pulse quickened. "Hey, babe," he greeted, leaning down to kiss her. Julia smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind of smile that normally greeted him. Instead of the usual kiss on the lips, she kissed him quickly on the cheek, something that struck him immediately as odd. "Hi, Mark. How was your day?" she asked, her voice soft but a little distant. "It was fine. You know, just the usual crazy day at work," he replied, settling into the chair across from her, trying to ignore the sudden discomfort in the air. But her body language, her avoidance of eye contact, made it hard for him to feel at ease. "You sure you're okay?" Mark asked, leaning forward, trying to get her attention. Something in his gut told him that this wasn't just pre-wedding stress, as she'd claimed before. Julia didn't answer right away. She hesitated, looking at her phone again before setting it down on the table. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little tired," she murmured, clearly avoiding his gaze. Mark furrowed his brow, his intuition kicking in. "Julia, we've been planning this wedding for months. You're acting strange. What's going on?" She sighed deeply, and for the first time that evening, looked him in the eyes, her gaze unreadable. "Nothing, Mark. I'm just a little stressed. You know how it is with all the details. Don't worry about me." Mark was about to speak again, but his phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his train of thought. He pulled it out, distracted. It was a message from David, his best friend, and also his groomsman. It wasn't unusual for David to message him regarding wedding details, but the tone of the message was peculiar. "Mark, you need to check the security footage from your apartment." Mark frowned and quickly opened the message, staring at the words, trying to make sense of what David was implying. Security footage? He thought. Why would David send him something like this? He felt an odd tightening in his chest. He'd known David since college. They had been inseparable, always supportive of each other through thick and thin. David was like a brother to him. But lately, he had been acting strange. Mark tried to dismiss the thought and decided to text back, but before he could, the words security footage gnawed at him. He thought back to the camera system in their apartment, something they'd set up years ago for security purposes. It was rare that he even looked at it anymore. His stomach churned as he turned to Julia. "I'll be right back," he said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had begun to take root. Julia barely looked up from her phone as she muttered, "Sure, go ahead." Mark excused himself and walked to the restroom, his mind swirling with questions. Why would David be asking him to look at the footage? Had something happened? A slight anxiety gripped him as he pulled out his phone and opened the security app. The camera feed came up on his screen first, the front door, then the living room. He tapped the timeline, skimming through the footage until he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. There, in the frame, were Julia and David. They were sitting on the couch in his living room, their bodies close, laughing together. But then, Mark watched, frozen in place as they kissed. Slowly at first, then more passionately. Mark's stomach dropped to his feet. He didn't need to see more. The realization hit him hard, knocking the wind out of his chest. His best friend, his fiancée, both of them had betrayed him. He could barely comprehend what he was seeing. He felt his throat tighten, as if the air itself was too thick to breathe. As the video ended, his phone buzzed again. Another message from David. I didn't want to do this over text, but I think you deserve to know. I'm so sorry, Julia and I. We've been seeing each other for months now. It just happened, and I regret it. I don't know how to make this right. Mark stared at the screen, his hands shaking, trying to process the words. The betrayal, the deceit. His mind raced, but there was nothing he could do to change what he had just seen. His life, his perfect life, was now shattered into pieces. The man he trusted with everything, his best friend, had destroyed him. The woman he loved had lied to him. The pain was suffocating. But Mark knew one thing. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something else. Something he had to face, no matter how much it hurt. Mark stood frozen in the small restroom, staring at his phone in disbelief. The image of Julia and David kissing replayed over and over in his mind, each moment more excruciating than the last. He had to steady himself against the sink, his reflection in the mirror looking like a stranger. His thoughts raced, his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He had trusted them both with everything. How had it all gone so wrong? The buzzing of his phone pulled him back to reality, and he stared at the screen, almost afraid to read the next message. But there it was, a new text from David. Mark, please. We need to talk. I don't want to do this over text, but I can't let you walk in on us and not explain everything. Meet me at the bar on 5th Street. I'm sorry. I really am. His hand shook as he dropped the phone on the counter. The room felt suffocating. A wave of anger swept over him, like a tide crashing over everything he had built. How dare David? How dare Julia? He had trusted both of them implicitly, shared his dreams with them, and now his world was shattered. For what felt like an eternity, Mark stood there in the restroom, fighting the urge to lash out, to break something, to scream. But instead, he did nothing. He just stared at the wall, his mind blank, the pain too overwhelming to process. After a while, he took a deep breath and turned the handle of the door, walking back out into the cafe where Julia was still sitting, oblivious. Her phone was on the table now, and her eyes were cast downward, scanning something she wasn't interested in. He didn't know if she was nervous or guilty, or maybe just lost in her thoughts. But he knew one thing. The facade they had built together was over. Mark approached the table slowly, trying to steady his breath, to keep his emotions in check. But how could he? How could he control what he was feeling right now? His stomach churned with rage, betrayal, and disbelief. He sat down opposite Julia, his chair scraping against the floor louder than it should have. She looked up at him, her smile faltering when she saw his face. Mark, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. He didn't say anything at first. He couldn't. The words wouldn't come. The only thing he could hear was the rush of blood in his ears, pounding with the intensity of the moment. He opened his mouth to speak, but all he could muster was a low, shaky breath. Mark? Julia asked again, her voice tinged with concern. She leaned forward, her hand reaching across the table to touch his. Talk to me, please. You're scaring me. He pulled his hand back, as if her touch had burned him. He stared at her, his eyes cold. Scaring you? You're the one who should be scared, Julia. Her expression faltered, confusion settling on her face. What's going on? Why are you acting like this? His voice came out in a low, tight whisper. I saw the footage, Julia. The security footage from the apartment. Julia froze. Her face paled, and for a second, Mark thought she might faint. What are you talking about? She stammered. I saw you, with David, kissing him, in our apartment, in our home. His words were sharp, cutting through the thick tension that had started to settle between them. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mark watched as her expression shifted from shock to guilt. It was clear now there was no point in pretending. She was caught, and she knew it. Mark, please, Julia whispered, her voice cracking. She reached for his hand again, but this time, Mark yanked it away. He couldn't bear her touch. Not now. Not after everything she had done. Please, what? He snapped. Please tell me why you did this. Please tell me how you could do this to me. To us? I trusted you, Julia. I loved you. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a brief second, Mark felt a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with. But then the anger surged again, pushing the flicker aside. Don't know what happened, Mark. It just happened. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. Julia's voice was trembling now, and Mark could see her fighting the tears. How long? He demanded, his voice louder than before. The cafe seemed to blur around him, but he couldn't care less. How long has this been going on? How many nights did you sleep in my bed, in our bed, while you were with him? 6 months, Julia whispered, her head bowed in shame. I'm so sorry, Mark. I didn't know how to tell you. I never meant for it to go this far. I just didn't know what to do. Mark shook his head, his vision narrowing. 6 months? 6 months of lying to him. 6 months of betrayal. The anger inside him surged again, hot and suffocating. You slept with him, Julia, while we were planning our wedding. While I was over here, trying to build our future, you were with him. His voice was shaking with emotion, but this time it wasn't sadness. It was fury. How could you? I don't know, Mark. I don't know. It was a mistake. A huge mistake. I wish I could take it all back. Mark stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. The world around him felt too small, too close. He needed to get out. I can't do this. I can't talk to you right now. Julia stood up too, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Please, just listen to me. We can fix this. I love you. I never wanted to hurt you. But Mark was already walking toward the door. He couldn't listen anymore. He couldn't look at her anymore. He didn't want to hear the excuses. The words felt like nails on a chalkboard, and he just needed to leave. Mark stormed out of the cafe, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. The city around him felt alien, like a world he no longer belonged to. His mind was spinning, and the anger was consuming him. But beneath that anger, beneath the betrayal, there was something else, something darker, something that told him that the man he had been, the life he had built, no longer existed. He had to start over. He had to find a new path. His phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Julia. It was a text from David. Mark, I'm sorry. I know I've ruined everything, but I want to make things right. Please, meet me at the bar on 5th Street. We need to talk. The last thing Mark wanted to do was talk to David. His best friend had betrayed him in the worst way possible. But something inside him told him he needed to face this. He needed answers, and David owed him that. Mark's hands trembled as he shoved his phone back into his pocket. The air outside was colder than he expected, the crispness of the evening adding to the chill in his bones. His mind raced, and his chest tightened with every step he took toward 5th Street. He had left Julia in the cafe, her words lingering in his mind like a haunting echo. 6 months. That's how long she had been seeing David, his best friend, the man he trusted like a brother. How could he have been so blind? The life he thought he was building was nothing more than an illusion. A perfect little picture of success and love, torn apart by the truth. But the hardest part? The hardest part was knowing that David knew. David knew and had still gone behind his back, betraying their friendship. It wasn't just Julia who had shattered him, it was the man who had been by his side through thick and thin. The man who had stood by him at his promotion party, the man who had been the best man at his wedding. How could David, of all people, do this? As Mark approached the bar, the buzzing of the city faded into the background. He entered through the heavy wooden doors, the dim lighting and clinking glasses inside a stark contrast to the storm inside his own mind. He spotted David almost immediately, sitting at the bar, looking like he had been waiting for hours. His posture was slumped, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey. The sight of him made Mark's stomach churn. David looked up as Mark approached. There was no shock in his eyes, just guilt. He had known Mark would come, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. Mark. David's voice was low, apologetic, but there was something distant in his eyes, something that Mark couldn't place. You really think I'd just let this go? Mark's voice came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't care. He couldn't keep his anger bottled up anymore. You think I'm just going to forget what you did to me? David swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the glass in his hand. I never wanted it to happen, man. You have to understand that. It just happened. Mark's fists clenched at his sides. It just happened? The words felt like a slap in the face. How could David, someone he'd known for years, treat it so casually? How could he betray him like this? Do you even know what you've done? Mark spat, his anger rising with each word. You've destroyed everything I've worked for. I trusted you. I trusted you. You were my best friend. And you. Mark, please, I'm not proud of what I did. I'm not. David interrupted, his voice breaking. I never meant to hurt you. This thing between Julia and me, time spiraled out of control. But I never wanted to destroy your life. Mark could barely hear David's words over the pounding in his head. How could he be so calm? How could he sit there, in front of him, and act like everything was fine? Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Why? He asked. his voice quieter but still thick with emotion. Why, David? I don't understand. Why Julia? Why not anyone else? Why did you do this to us? David's gaze flickered to the floor, unable to meet Mark's eyes. I don't have an answer for that, Mark. I don't know why it happened. It just did. But I know this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mark stared at him for a moment, the words not quite sinking in. His mind refused to accept what was happening. This wasn't the man he thought he knew. This wasn't the friend he had spent years trusting, laughing with, sharing his deepest secrets. This was a stranger sitting in front of him. You're sorry? Mark's voice trembled with disbelief. That's it? You're sorry? What about the years of friendship? What about everything we've been through? You think a simple sorry fixes this? David's hands tightened around the glass in front of him. Number, I know nothing can fix this, but I can't change what happened. All I can do is say that I'm sorry, and I understand if you never want to speak to me again. The words hung in the air, like a confession and a plea, but they didn't reach Mark's heart. The hurt was too deep. He had been betrayed by the two people he trusted most in the world. His fiancée, the woman he was about to marry. His best friend. Both of them had turned on him, and now all that was left was emptiness. Mark felt the weight of the moment press down on him. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, they all mingled together, making it hard to breathe. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, David, he whispered, the words harder to say than he imagined. David nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. I know, and I wouldn't blame you if you couldn't. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to be honest with you. I didn't want to hide anymore. I didn't want to be a coward. Mark stood up suddenly, the room spinning slightly as he did. The weight of the conversation, the confrontation, had drained him. He didn't know what to say anymore. He didn't know what to do with the anger bubbling in his chest. I'm done, David, Mark said, his voice flat, distant. I don't know if I'll ever trust you again, and I don't know if I'll ever see you the same way. But right now, I need to go. I need to be alone. David didn't say anything. He just sat there, looking defeated, watching Mark walk out of the bar without a second glance. Mark stepped out into the cold New York night, the bustling city streets around him feeling foreign. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he needed to leave. The pain was suffocating, and the anger he had tried to suppress had exploded. He couldn't look at David the same way, and he couldn't be with Julia anymore. Everything felt broken. His perfect life, his perfect future, shattered in the blink of an eye. He didn't know where to go from here, but he couldn't stay in this moment. Not with David's betrayal still fresh in his mind. Not with the image of Julia and David together still haunting him. Mark needed to find a way out, a way to rebuild, a way to heal. But how could he? How could he move on from something like this? Mark walked aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan, his steps almost mechanical as he tried to process everything that had happened. The cool evening air cut through him, but he barely felt it. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, anger, disbelief, sadness, and none of it made sense. The city, once vibrant and alive, now seemed suffocating. Every corner he turned, every face he passed felt like a reminder of his shattered world. His life, his trust in the people closest to him, had just been torn apart. He found himself at the edge of the park, standing by the railing, looking out over the water. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness that was closing in on him. His hands were still shaking, his chest tight with the weight of what he had learned. He had always thought he was in control of his life, but now, everything seemed like it was slipping through his fingers. Mark closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. He could still hear David's voice in his head, still see the look of guilt in his eyes. The apology was hollow, and the realization hit him hard. David wasn't the friend he thought he was. And Julia? Julia had shattered his heart into 1,000 pieces. 6 months. 6 months of lies. 6 months of betrayal. Mark had loved her with everything he had. He had built a future with her. But it was all a lie. She had lied to him, and so had David. How could they do this to him? How could they betray him in the worst possible way? And for what? Was it worth it? The question echoed in his mind, but the answer was painfully clear. No, it wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth destroying the trust he had built, the life he had worked so hard to create. He turned away from the railing and began walking again, not knowing where he was going but not caring either. His feet carried him through the streets, past the familiar buildings, past the places he had once shared memories with Julia. Every step was like a weight, a reminder of what he had lost. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence of the night. Mark pulled it out, already knowing who it was. Julia. He had no intention of answering it. But as the screen lit up with her name, something inside him shifted. Maybe he wasn't ready to face her, but he couldn't avoid this forever. Not if he wanted closure. Not if he wanted to move on. He hit the green button. Mark, please pick up. Julia's voice came through, strained and desperate. I need to talk to you. We can't just leave things like this. Please. He stood still for a moment, looking at the phone in his hand. His heart ached as he heard the pleading in her voice, but the anger was louder now. He couldn't let her manipulate him. Not anymore. Not after everything. I don't want to talk to you, Julia, Mark said, his voice cold but steady. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear you beg me to understand. You and David, you've destroyed everything. I never meant for it to happen, Julia said, her voice breaking. Mark, please. We were planning our wedding. I don't know how it went so far. I love you. I've always loved you. But I made a huge mistake. Mark's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles white. A huge mistake, he repeated, his voice rising. 6 months, Julia. 6 months of lying to me. 6 months of betrayal. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. And now, you want me to just forgive you? I didn't mean to hurt you, Mark. I never wanted this. I swear, I never wanted to lose you. Julia's voice was shaking now. Please, just talk to me. Please let me explain. He could hear the desperation in her voice, but it only fueled the rage inside him. She thought she could just talk her way out of this? She thought she could just explain away the hurt, the damage she had caused? Explain what, Julia? He asked, his voice low, dangerously calm. How you and my best friend decided to sleep together behind my back. How you lied to me every day. You think I can just forgive that? You think I can just move on like nothing happened? There was a long pause on the other end, and Mark could hear Julia crying softly. It made his chest tighten, but he refused to feel sympathy. He couldn't. Not right now. I don't know what to say, Julia whispered. I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, I'm begging you. Don't just end things like this. Mark closed his eyes, taking a slow breath. I don't know if I can even look at you the same way again, Julia. I don't know if I'll ever trust you again. I don't know if I can ever forget what you've done. I never meant to hurt you, she repeated, her voice small. Please, Mark. Please don't leave me. The words hung in the air between them, and Mark could feel the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had loved her so much, but now all of that seemed irrelevant. The love he had felt, the life they had planned, none of it mattered anymore. Julia had made her choice. She had chosen David, and she had destroyed everything they had built. I can't do this, Mark said quietly, his voice heavy with finality. I can't stay in a relationship where I can't trust you. I can't pretend everything's fine when it's not. I need to move on, Julia, and I need to do that alone. There was silence on the other end of the line for a long moment before Julia spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, Mark. I am. He didn't say anything else. He just hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the words settle in. He had just ended his relationship with the woman he had planned to marry. He had just severed ties with the person who had been his closest friend. The coldness in his chest grew. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was emptiness. A hollow space that felt like it had been carved out of him. How could they do this? How could they betray him in the worst way possible? Mark stood still in the middle of the sidewalk, the city buzzing around him, but he felt like he was in another world. A world where everything was different. He had been so sure of his future. He had been so sure that everything would fall into place. But now he was lost. And the only thing he could do was take it one step at a time. He turned and began walking again, not knowing where he was going. But he couldn't stay where he was. Not now. Not after everything. The days following his confrontation with Julia and David felt like a blur. Mark wasn't sure where time went. The world around him continued to spin, but he felt detached, as though he was standing outside of his own life, watching it unfold from a distance. He spent the first few days in a haze, not really eating or sleeping, just pacing around his apartment. Every inch of the space that had once felt like home now felt like a prison, each corner a reminder of the life he had lost. The photos on the walls, the furniture, the little mementos they had collected together, it all felt suffocating. He had tried to reach out to friends, but none of the conversations felt right. People asked how he was doing, but he could never answer honestly. How was he supposed to say that he was lost? That everything he had believed in was a lie? So instead, he kept things brief, always hiding the full weight of his pain. At work, Mark threw himself into his projects. His career had always been a steady anchor in his life, and now it was his only escape. He worked long hours, taking on extra cases, and staying late into the night, trying to drown out the noise of his thoughts. But no matter how hard he worked, there was no escaping the empty space in his heart, the aching feeling that lingered even when he was distracted. One evening, as he sat at his desk, staring blankly at a case file, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his old college friend, Mike. They hadn't spoken much recently, but Mike had always been there for him, through thick and thin. "Hey man, how about a drink this weekend? We could catch up. I know things have been tough for you lately." Mark stared at the message, his finger hovering over the screen. Part of him wanted to respond, to reach out, but another part of him was scared. He didn't want to burden anyone with his pain, didn't want to let anyone see how far he had fallen. But then he remembered what his therapist had told him. "You don't have to carry this alone." Maybe it was time to let someone in, to talk. He typed a quick reply. "Sure, sounds good. I'll meet you on Saturday." Saturday came faster than he expected. Mark showed up at the bar Mike had suggested, a cozy pub in the East Village with dim lighting and a relaxed atmosphere. When he walked in, he immediately spotted Mike sitting at the bar, a pint in front of him, looking up at the television screen. But his eyes quickly found Mark. "Hey man, good to see you," Mike said, standing up and giving him a hug. It had been a while since they last saw each other, and Mark could feel the warmth of his friend's presence. It was a small comfort, but one he appreciated. Mike gestured to the seat next to him. "Come on, sit down. Drinks on me." Mark sat down, running his fingers along the rim of the glass in front of him, unsure of where to start. The silence between them was comfortable, not awkward, as they both let the moment linger. Finally, Mike spoke up. "So, how are you really doing, Mark?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was concern in his eyes. "I know you've been through a lot." Mark hesitated, taking a deep breath. How could he even begin to explain? How could he put into words the ache that had consumed him for weeks? But Mike was his friend. He trusted him. So, he let the words spill out. "Honestly, I'm lost. I feel like everything in my life just fell apart. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I thought I had it all. Julia, my career, everything. And now it feels like it was all a lie." Mike listened quietly, his expression softening. He knew Mark well enough to understand that he wasn't one to share his feelings openly. This was a big step for him. "Julia and David," Mark continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I never saw it coming. 6 months. They were together for 6 months, behind my back, and I had no clue. I thought they were my family, and now I don't know what to do with any of it." Mike reached over and put a hand on Mark's shoulder. "I can't even begin to imagine what you're going through, man. But listen, you're not alone in this. You don't have to figure everything out right now. Take it one step at a time." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "One step at a time? I don't even know where to start." "You start by letting yourself heal. You start by talking about it, by not bottling it up. It's okay to not have all the answers, Mark. It's okay to be broken right now." Mark nodded, taking in Mike's words. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding in. He had spent so much time trying to appear strong, trying to keep it together, that he hadn't allowed himself to just feel the pain. He hadn't allowed himself to grieve. But Mike was right. He didn't have to fix everything all at once. Maybe it was time to let himself feel, even if it meant accepting the pain. "So what's next?" Mark asked quietly. "How do I move on from this? How do I rebuild?" Mike took a long sip from his drink before responding. "Rebuilding isn't easy, and it's not something that happens overnight. But it starts with you. You need to take care of yourself first. Don't worry about anything else for now. Take time for you. Focus on your well-being. And remember, it's okay to lean on your friends when you need help. Don't carry this by yourself." Mark sat back in his seat, his mind racing with the advice Mike had given him. He had been so consumed by anger and betrayal that he had forgotten the most important thing. He needed to heal. He needed to give himself time to recover. And maybe, just maybe, he could start to rebuild his life from the ground up. "I've been so focused on fixing everything," Mark said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't even realize that I'm the one who needs fixing." "You're not broken, man," Mike replied with a grin. "You're just human, and you'll get through this. It'll take time, but you'll come out stronger on the other side." Mark looked at his friend, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't realized he needed. It wasn't just about the pain anymore, it was about what came next. He couldn't keep running from his past, but he could choose to move forward. It was going to be a long road, but for the first time in weeks, Mark felt like he might be able to walk it. Later that night, as Mark walked home through the quiet streets of the city, the weight on his shoulders seemed a little lighter. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the past define him. It would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to control him. He had a life to rebuild, and he was going to start living again. He didn't have all the answers, but at least for tonight, he had hope. The days after his conversation with Mike felt different, though Mark still had a long way to go. It wasn't like the pain had vanished, nor did the sting of betrayal fade overnight. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since everything fell apart. Hope. Hope didn't mean he had found all the answers, or that he had figured out how to move on completely, but it was the first sign that healing was possible. He didn't know exactly what the future would look like, but he wasn't going to let the past define him anymore. He had spent too long letting it control his every thought, every decision. Now, it was time to take control of his own life again. Mark had taken Mike's advice to heart. He began to make small, deliberate changes, starting with his daily routine. He forced himself to get out of the apartment every morning, even if it was just for a walk. He had spent so many hours hiding in his own space, wallowing in the pain of the betrayal, but now he was trying to break the cycle. One morning, as he was getting dressed, he looked at the photo frame on his dresser. It was a picture of him and Julia on their trip to the mountains last year, smiling, carefree. The photo used to bring him comfort, but now it felt like a reminder of the life he had lost. He took the frame and walked over to the trash can, hesitating. The thought of throwing it away made his stomach turn. But then he remembered what Mike had said. You need to let go of what doesn't serve you anymore. With a sigh, Mark tossed the picture into the trash. It felt like a small act, but it was one step closer to reclaiming his life, one step closer to freeing himself from the memories that had been holding him back. As the days turned into weeks, Mark started finding new routines that didn't revolve around work or the painful reminders of Julia and David. He began going to the gym more regularly, something he had once enjoyed but had neglected in the wake of everything that had happened. The physical exhaustion felt good. It allowed him to focus on his body, to push himself, and for those few hours, he didn't have to think about the pain. He could just focus on getting stronger. But it wasn't just about his body. He realized that his emotional health needed just as much attention. One evening, after a particularly tough workout, Mark sat in the locker room, drenched in sweat, his mind buzzing. It was then that he remembered something he hadn't thought about in Yersh's love for painting. Back when he was younger, painting had been his escape, his outlet for self-expression. But as he grew older, the pressures of life had pushed it aside. That night, Mark found his old art supplies tucked away in the back of his closet. The canvas was small, the paints a little dried out, but the memory of those late nights spent creating something beautiful came rushing back to him. With a deep breath, Mark set up a small corner in his apartment and began to paint again. He didn't care about the technique or the end result. He just needed to release his emotions, to let his pain flow through his hands and onto the canvas. The first few strokes felt awkward, forced. His mind kept drifting back to Julia, to David, to the betrayal that had ripped apart everything he thought he knew. But the more he painted, the easier it became. The act of creating something, of transforming his pain into something visual, felt cathartic. It felt like he was reclaiming a part of himself that he had lost. The next morning, Mark stood back and looked at the painting. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had created something. He had taken the first step toward healing, and that was enough. But even as he embraced his new routines, the reality of the situation still lingered in the background. His thoughts occasionally drifted back to Julia and David. He still couldn't understand how they could have done this to him. How could they betray his trust, destroy the foundation of everything he had built? But now, there was a growing realization inside of him. As much as they had hurt him, they didn't have control over his future. He did. One afternoon, Mark decided to take a different approach. Instead of spending the weekend brooding in his apartment, he booked a flight to California to visit a few old friends from law school. It was a spontaneous decision, but one that felt right. He needed a change of scenery, a new environment to help clear his head. The trip was both liberating and uncomfortable. It was liberating because it was the first time in a long time that he was doing something for himself, without worrying about what anyone else would think. But it was also uncomfortable because it forced him to confront the fact that he was still healing, still vulnerable. When he arrived in California, he was greeted by friends who hadn't seen him in months. They were kind, welcoming, and genuinely happy to see him. but their questions about his personal life hit a little too close to home. "How's the wedding planning going?" one of his friends, Karen, asked, a warm smile on her face. Mark froze. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he didn't know how to respond. The thought of the wedding, the plans, the dreams was still too painful. He could feel the lump in his throat, but he quickly composed himself. "Actually, we broke up," Mark said, his voice faltering just slightly. He hadn't expected to say it out loud to anyone outside of Mike. But there it was, the truth, coming out of his mouth. Karen's smile faltered, and she reached out to him. "I'm so sorry, Mark. I had no idea." "It's okay," Mark said, shaking his head. It's been rough, but I'm figuring it out." The days in California passed quickly, filled with laughter, beach walks, and conversations about life, law, and the future. By the time Mark flew back to New York, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trip had given him perspective. It reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were people who cared about him, who wanted him to succeed. And it showed him that life, despite the heartbreak, was still full of possibilities. When he returned to his apartment, Mark made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to wallow in the past anymore. He wasn't going to let Julia or David control his future. He was going to rebuild not just his career, but his sense of self. He would be the man he always wanted to be, without relying on anyone else to define him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the pain would resurface, days when he would question everything. But Mark was determined. He wasn't going to let his past define his future. He was going to take it one step at a time, and that was all he could do. And as he sat down in front of his easel again, the paintbrush in his hand, he realized something important. He didn't have to have everything figured out. He just had to keep moving forward. And with each stroke of the brush, with each step he took, he was one step closer to the man he wanted to be. The city of New York buzzed around Mark as he stepped out of his apartment, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. The past few weeks had been a blur, filled with the whirlwind of emotional highs and lows. But as he walked down the streets, through the familiar streets of Manhattan, something felt different. He wasn't running away from anything anymore. He wasn't trying to hide from the past. Instead, he was walking towards something new. Mark had spent so much time trying to make sense of the betrayal, trying to figure out why Julia and David had done what they did. But now, he realized that understanding their actions wasn't what mattered. What mattered was how he chose to move forward. And for the first time in months, he felt ready to take that step. It had been 3 weeks since he'd left for California. The time away had given him a fresh perspective. He had reconnected with friends, rediscovered old passions, and allowed himself to breathe. But most importantly, he had allowed himself to feel again. He had let go of the anger, the bitterness, and the resentment that had been weighing him down. He had forgiven himself for not seeing the signs, for trusting the wrong people. Now, he was ready to start fresh. Mark wasn't sure what the future held, but he was no longer afraid of it. He had come to realize that life wasn't about avoiding pain or heartbreak. It was about learning to grow from it. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a step in the right direction. He had started painting again, something that had always brought him peace. But now, his focus had shifted. His art wasn't just about creating beauty. It was about expressing his emotions, his journey. Each brushstroke was a symbol of his recovery, his rebirth. But it wasn't just art that had captured his attention. Mark had also been focusing on his career. He was determined to take his law practice to the next level, to create something that was uniquely his. He had spent the past few weeks networking, reaching out to potential clients, and expanding his professional circle. The work was challenging, but Mark found a sense of purpose in it that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the money or the success, it was about creating something meaningful, something that would help him reclaim control of his life. One evening, after a long day of work, Mark sat down at his desk and began reviewing a proposal for a new client. His phone buzzed, interrupting his focus. It was a message from Mike. "Hey, I've got something to tell you. Meet me at the same place tomorrow at 7? Mark smiled, setting down his pen. Mike had become a steady support in his life since the breakdown with Julia and David. He had been there when Mark needed someone to listen, to remind him that he wasn't alone in this world. The fact that Mike wanted to meet up again told him that this wasn't just a casual chat. Something was on Mike's mind. He quickly typed a response. "Sounds good. I'll be there." The next evening, Mark met Mike at their usual bar. The atmosphere was warm, with the soft hum of chatter around them. Mark had begun to appreciate these small moments, the quiet conversations that weren't clouded by drama or pain. When Mike saw him walk in, he waved him over to the table. "Glad you could make it, man," Mike said as they shook hands and sat down. "What's up?" Mark asked, his curiosity piqued. Mike seemed more serious than usual. Mike took a deep breath and looked around the room, ensuring no one was listening. "I've been thinking a lot about you lately, Mark, and I think it's time we talk about something important." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What's going on, Mike?" Mike shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I need to be honest with you, man. There's something I've been keeping from you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Mark's stomach sank. Was this about Julia? Was Mike involved in some way? He could feel the familiar knot forming in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had learned how to control his emotions, even when they felt overwhelming. "What is it, Mike?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm the one who introduced David to Julia," Mike said, his words slow and heavy. "I know I should have told you this sooner. I didn't think it would turn into what it did, but I was the one who suggested they meet. And if I'm being completely honest, I've regretted it ever since." Mark sat back in his chair, stunned. His thoughts raced, trying to process what Mike had just confessed. The betrayal felt even more profound now. Not only had David done something unforgivable, but Mike, the one person he thought he could trust, had been involved in some way. Mark took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" His voice was quiet but intense. "Why did you let this happen, Mike?" Mike looked down at the table, his hands gripping the glass in front of him. "I didn't think it would get this far. I never meant for it to happen. At first, I thought they would just go out for a drink, catch up as friends. But then, I didn't know how to stop it. By the time I realized what was going on, I was already too deep. I didn't know how to come to you with this, and I'm sorry. I should have been a better friend." Mark's mind was spinning, but he knew he needed to make sense of this. He had already lost Julia and David. Now, Mike's confession felt like another betrayal, but it was different. It wasn't the same kind of romantic betrayal. It was a missed tone that Mike clearly regretted. But still, the pain was real. "You should have told me, Mike," Mark said quietly. "You should have told me the truth, even if it hurt. I would have respected you more for it." Mike nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I know, and I can't change what happened. All I can do is say that I'm sorry. I've been a bad friend, Mark, and I don't expect you to forgive me." Mark sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation sinking in. He wasn't sure what to say next. He wasn't even sure what he was feeling anymore. All he knew was that he was tired of holding on to the past. He was tired of feeling like a victim. "I don't know what to say," Mark admitted, looking Mike in the eye. "But I'm not going to let this ruin me. I've spent enough time being angry. I need to let go of all of this." Mike looked relieved, but there was still a hint of sorrow in his eyes. "That's the first step, man. You'll get through this. I know it." Mark nodded. For the first time in a long time, he felt a small shift inside him. Maybe he couldn't forget what had happened. Maybe he couldn't forgive them all at once. But he was ready to move on. He was ready to take the first real step toward healing. Later that night, as Mark walked home, he couldn't help but feel like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The conversation with Mike had been difficult, but it had brought a certain clarity to his mind. The truth was out. He had confronted the past, and now it was time to let it go. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to understand something important. He could move forward. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was his to walk. And as he looked ahead, he realized that for the first time in months, he felt like he was on the right path. The city around him buzzed with life, but Mark was focused on the future. He was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed Mark's conversation with Mike marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The road to recovery was not a straight line, nor was it always easy. But each day brought something new realizations, new steps, and new challenges. But for the first time in months, Mark felt like he was finally in control again, no longer lost in the sea of his emotions. One of the first decisions he made after talking with Mike was to stop avoiding the places that had been filled with painful memories. He had spent so much time trying to shield himself from his past, retreating into work, staying inside his apartment, avoiding places he used to visit with Julia. But as he ventured back into these familiar spaces, he realized something. It wasn't the places that had caused him pain. It was the attachment he had to them, the memories he had allowed to define him. He started small, a walk in the park, a visit to his favorite coffee shop, where he and Julia used to go on Sunday mornings. He was cautious at first, the memories of their laughter and conversations still fresh in his mind. But with each passing visit, Mark began to feel the weight of the past lifting. It was like peeling back layers of old wounds, allowing the scars to breathe. One morning, as he sat in that same coffee shop, a strange sense of peace washed over him. He looked around at the people chatting, the barista preparing drinks, and he realized that he was no longer consumed by his pain. He wasn't pretending to be fine, but he wasn't letting his past dictate his every move either. The world around him was still vibrant, still full of life, and so was he. Mark had also started spending more time focusing on his career. He had always been good at his job, meticulous, detail-oriented, and driven, but now he had an entirely new perspective. Instead of just focusing on the next big case, he had become more involved in pro bono work, helping those who couldn't afford his services. The work was fulfilling in ways he hadn't expected. It gave him a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to wealth or status. It reminded him that his life, his success, wasn't just about material things, it was about making a difference. One afternoon, after a particularly successful pro bono case, Mark was walking back to his office when he bumped into an old colleague from law school, Sarah. They had kept in touch over the years, but hadn't seen each other in person for quite some time. She was a successful corporate lawyer, but Mark had always admired her passion for social justice. They shared a brief, friendly conversation before Sarah mentioned something that caught Mark off guard. "You know, I've been thinking about branching out, doing some of the kind of work you've been doing. It's so much more fulfilling than the stuff we usually handle in corporate law," Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. "You've really inspired me, Mark." Mark smiled, a genuine sense of pride swelling inside him. "I'm glad to hear that. It's funny you always think you're the one learning from others, but sometimes we end up learning from ourselves." They exchanged contact information, promising to meet up for coffee soon. Mark had been so focused on his own journey of healing that he hadn't realized how much his work was influencing others. It wasn't about just him anymore. It was about the impact he could make in the lives of those around him, and that realization was a turning point. He wasn't just recovering from heartbreak, he was growing, becoming more than the man he had been before. The nights were still the hardest for Mark. There were moments, late at night when the city was quiet, when the weight of his thoughts would return. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep as his mind wandered back to Julia, to David, to the life he had imagined. The anger would still flare up sometimes, but he had learned to sit with it, to let it pass instead of trying to bury it. The healing process wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, but each day was a step forward. One evening, as Mark sat in his apartment, he felt a pull to pick up the phone and call someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time. His mother. He had kept his distance from her during the worst of his pain. He hadn't wanted to burden her with his struggles, and he hadn't known how to explain what had happened. But now, after all the changes, after all the progress, he felt ready to reach out. It had been months since they had spoken at length. His heart was heavy with the thought of how much time had passed. Mark dialed her number, the familiar sound of the ringing phone filling the quiet room. When she picked up, her voice was filled with warmth, instantly making him feel like he was back in the safety of her embrace, even if only over the phone. "Mark, is everything okay?" His mother's voice was filled with concern, but there was a gentleness there, the same gentleness he remembered from when he was a child. "Hey, Mom," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, everything's fine. I wanted to talk. It's been a while." She paused for a moment. "You sound different, Mark. What's been going on?" "I've been worried about you." He took a deep breath. "I've been through a lot, Mom. I won't lie. I had some things happen that changed my life. But I'm okay now. I'm getting through it." His mother listened quietly, not interrupting. She knew her son well enough to understand when he needed to talk and when he needed space. After a long pause, she spoke softly. "I'm glad to hear that, honey. You've always been strong. I know this won't be easy, but I have no doubt you'll come out of this stronger than before." The conversation with his mother was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this world. He had family. He had friends. He had a support system. And as much as he had tried to shut them out during his pain, they had always been there, waiting for him to open up. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." "Anytime, sweetheart, I love you." "I love you too," Mark replied, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. The next morning, Mark woke up with a newfound sense of clarity. It was like something inside him had shifted. He wasn't sure what it was, but he felt ready. Ready to take on the world again, to embrace whatever the future held. He had made peace with the past, not forgotten it, but accepted it as part of who he was. And now, he was ready to move forward. He looked out the window at the city below him, the sun shining brightly over the skyline. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own life. He felt like he was finally part of the world again. Mark wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time in months, he was excited to find out. It had been several months since Mark had made the decision to start fresh, and he was finally starting to feel like himself again. The city around him had become less of a reminder of the past and more of a backdrop to his future. New York had always been a place of opportunity, but now, it felt like the city of new beginnings. Not just for him, but for the person he was becoming. The progress hadn't been easy, and there were still days when he woke up feeling the weight of what had happened. But those days were becoming fewer and fewer, and the nights were quieter. The anger that had once kept him up at night was now replaced with a sense of peace. Mark had taken to meditating in the mornings, something he'd never considered before, but it had helped him find balance. He had also started running again, something he had always loved but stopped doing when life became too overwhelming. That Saturday morning, as Mark laced up his sneakers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first discovered Julia and David's betrayal. He had worked hard to get to where he was now, and while the past still lingered in his mind, it no longer controlled his every thought. He had learned to live in the present, to focus on the moment, and to take things one day at a time. Mark ran through Central Park, the cool breeze against his face making him feel more alive than he had in months. The rhythm of his feet on the pavement, the sound of his breath, it all brought him a sense of calm. As he ran, he thought about his next steps professionally and personally. He had been considering expanding his law practice, taking on more clients, and even mentoring some younger lawyers. He wanted to give back, to make a difference, just like he had done with the pro bono cases. But it wasn't just his career that had been shifting. Mark had also realized that, over time, he had begun to open up again to the possibility of relationships. Not just romantic relationships, but the kind of relationships that had once been a cornerstone of his life friendships. He had reconnected with a few old friends from college, people he hadn't seen in years, and they had welcomed him back with open arms. He had also started spending more time with his family, reconnecting with his parents, who had been worried about him during his darkest moments. But the one thing Mark hadn't expected to happen was the way his heart had begun to heal slowly, and in a way that surprised him. It was a few weeks after his run in Central Park when Mark found himself at a networking event for young professionals in the city. He wasn't particularly excited to attend, but his colleagues had convinced him that it would be good for business, and at this point he was willing to try anything. As he walked into the venue, he noticed the usual crowd of well-dressed professionals mingling and exchanging business cards. Mark had never been one for small talk, but he could feel himself falling back into the groove of it. He made his rounds, introduced himself to a few people, and gave his business card to someone who seemed genuinely interested in his work. It wasn't until later in the evening that Mark found himself standing by the bar, sipping on a drink, when he noticed a woman standing a few feet away from him. She was talking to another man, laughing, her face lit up by the soft light from the bar. There was something about her that caught Mark's attention. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, confident yet approachable. Or maybe it was the way her laugh seemed to fill the room with a sense of warmth. Before he knew it, their eyes met across the room, and she smiled at him. Mark felt a jolt of surprise. It had been so long since he'd felt that spark of attraction, that excitement in his chest. He was caught off guard, but he found himself walking toward her, drawn by an energy he couldn't explain. "Hi," Mark said, his voice tentative but steady. "I'm Mark." She extended her hand with a friendly smile. "I'm Rachel. Nice to meet you." They shook hands, and for a moment, Mark couldn't help but notice how easy the conversation flowed. Rachel was easy to talk to, funny, intelligent, and refreshingly down to earth. They talked about work, about life in the city, about their mutual interest in social justice and pro bono work. For the first time in a long time, Mark found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation, not feeling like he was pretending to be okay or forcing a smile. As the evening wore on, Mark realized that something had shifted within him. He wasn't looking for a relationship, he wasn't ready for that. But the fact that he could talk to someone like Rachel, someone who made him feel comfortable, made him realize just how far he had come. He wasn't the same man who had been consumed by heartbreak just months ago. He had grown, not just emotionally, but socially. He had learned to open up again, to engage with the world around him, and he wasn't afraid to let people in. As the event came to an end, Mark and Rachel exchanged numbers, agreeing to meet up for coffee sometime. Mark left the event feeling lighter than he had in a long time. He wasn't rushing into anything, but the idea of building new connections, of opening his heart to the possibility of something new, was both exciting and freeing. The next few days flew by, filled with work, meetings, and phone calls. But as Mark sat at his desk, reviewing a new case, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel. "Hey Mark, I had a great time talking to you the other night. Would you like to grab coffee sometime this week?" Mark smiled as he read the message. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what the future held. He wasn't afraid of letting himself feel again. He typed back, "That sounds great. How about Thursday afternoon?" Rachel replied almost immediately, "Perfect. See you then." As Mark set his phone down, he took a deep breath. He wasn't sure where this would go, or if it would go anywhere at all, but he was ready for it. Ready to explore what lay ahead, ready to build new connections, and most importantly, ready to keep moving forward. He wasn't just recovering from the past anymore. He was living in the present, embracing the future, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The next few weeks felt like a breath of fresh air for Mark. He had grown comfortable with the life he was rebuilding, one where the past didn't haunt him at every turn. For the first time in months, he felt like he was living, not just existing. He was starting to embrace the present and look ahead with excitement, not fear. The coffee with Rachel was everything Mark had hoped for. It wasn't a grand gesture or an overwhelming experience, but it was simple, genuine, and easy. They talked about everything life in the city, the challenges of their careers, and the kinds of things they enjoyed in their downtime. Mark found himself laughing, something that had become a rarity in his life after the betrayal. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people getting to know each other. Rachel was smart, funny, and passionate about her work in environmental law. She had a way of making everything feel lighthearted, and Mark couldn't remember the last time he'd been so comfortable around someone. The evening ended with a hug, and they agreed to meet up again soon. Mark didn't know where it would go, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to rush into anything. He was enjoying getting to know her, enjoying the connection without the weight of past baggage holding him back. Work continued to be a significant part of Mark's life, and his practice was thriving. He had taken Mike's advice to hear that wasn't just focusing on corporate law anymore. He had found new clients who needed help navigating the complexities of family law and pro bono work. It was a path that felt more fulfilling, more aligned with who he was becoming. But the real breakthrough came when Mark received an invitation to speak at a seminar on social justice law and community development. The thought of standing in front of a room full of people, speaking about his passion, was both exciting and terrifying. But Mark realized that this was another opportunity for growth. It wasn't just about the legal cases or the money, it was about giving back, making a difference in the world. It was about reclaiming his voice, the same voice that had been silenced by betrayal. He prepared for the seminar with a level of focus he hadn't felt in a long time. As the day of the event approached, he found himself eagerly anticipating the chance to share his journey, his experiences, and the lessons he had learned along the way. This wasn't just about professional success, it was about personal growth and the ways in which his pain had led him to discover new parts of himself. The night of the seminar, Mark stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was filled with professionals, students, and people passionate about justice and change. As he waited for his turn to speak, Mark couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude for the journey he had been on. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always smooth, but it had brought him here. It had brought him to this moment, where he was about to share his story with people who would listen and, hopefully, be inspired by what he had gone through. When his name was called, Mark took a deep breath and walked to the stage. He was nervous, but there was an unfamiliar confidence in his step. The lights of the auditorium were bright, but he didn't let them intimidate him. He focused on the audience, the people in front of him, and he began to speak. "Good evening," Mark began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Mark Williams, and I'm here to talk to you about something that's very personal to me, the journey of rebuilding after everything falls apart." The words flowed from him easily. He spoke about the pain of betrayal, the loss of trust, and how it had felt like his entire world had crumbled. He talked about the anger, the heartbreak, and the moment he realized he couldn't let the past control him any longer. But most importantly, he spoke about the journey to healing, the small steps he had taken, the people who had supported him, and the lessons he had learned along the way. "It's easy to get lost in the hurt," Mark said, his voice softening. "It's easy to let it consume you. But I've learned that you can't move forward by holding on to the past. You have to let go, not for the other person's sake, but for your own. You have to find the strength to forgive, not for them, but for yourself." As he spoke, Mark could see the reactions of the audience. Some of them were nodding, others were taking notes, but all of them were listening intently. It wasn't about his professional achievements or his legal expertise, it was about the raw, vulnerable truth of his experience. He wasn't just speaking to them as a lawyer. He was speaking to them as someone who had been through pain and had come out stronger on the other side. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Mark felt a warmth spread through him as he stepped down from the stage. It wasn't the applause that mattered, it was the knowledge that he had shared something meaningful. He had used his pain to help others, and that was something he could be proud of. The days following the seminar were filled with a sense of accomplishment. Mark received several emails from attendees who had been moved by his story. Some were students, others were professionals in the field, but all of them expressed how much his words had resonated with them. It was humbling, and it reminded him that his journey wasn't just about himself. It was about the people he could help along the way. One evening, as Mark was going through his emails, he saw a message from Rachel. They hadn't had much time to talk since their last coffee, but he had been thinking about her often. Her message was simple. "Hey Mark, I really enjoyed our last meeting. I was wondering if you'd like to grab dinner sometime this week?" Mark smiled as he read the message. It felt like the right time. He wasn't looking for anything serious, but he was open to seeing where things could go. He'd spent so long focusing on healing, and now it felt like he was finally ready to open his heart to the possibility of something new. He quickly typed back, "I'd love that. How about Thursday?" The next few days were filled with anticipation. Mark wasn't rushing into anything, but he could feel a spark. Rachel had become someone he genuinely enjoyed spending time with, and the idea of getting to know her better felt exciting, not overwhelming. Thursday evening came, and Mark found himself at a quiet restaurant downtown, waiting for Rachel. He had chosen this spot because it was intimate and away from the crowds, a place where they could talk without distractions. As he sat at the table, he felt a sense of calm. He wasn't anxious, wasn't second-guessing himself. He was simply excited to spend time with her again. When Rachel arrived, she looked as beautiful as ever, a smile lighting up her face as she approached him. They greeted each other with a hug, and for a moment, Mark felt a connection, something deeper than just casual conversation. The evening went by, effortlessly good food, great conversation, and plenty of laughter. They talked about their work, their interests, and even their pasts, but in a way that felt natural and light. It wasn't about baggage or pain, it was about enjoying each other's company. As the night came to a close, they stood up from the table. Mark could feel the warmth of her presence, the way her hand brushed against his. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. "This was really nice," Rachel said, her eyes meeting his. Mark smiled, feeling a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, it really was. I'm glad we did this." Rachel smiled back, and for a moment, Mark felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't looking for answers, and he wasn't trying to force anything. He was just living, taking each day as it came. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about what the future held.